Sometimes the most important families are the ones we choose to create, not the ones we're born into. Built by hearts big enough to hold children who have nowhere else to belong, by hands that remember how to braid hair and tie shoes for little ones who never learned what unconditional love feels like. That's what 72-year-old Margaret Grandma Maggie Thompson proved when she stood at the Family Feud podium with a small notebook clutched in her weathered hands, containing the names, birthdays, and dreams of 47 children who call her Grandma even though they share no blood, and gave an answer that stopped Steve Harvey's heart and reminded an entire television studio that family isn't about genetics, it's about showing up with love when someone needs it most. Margaret had been Grandma Maggie at the Sunrise Children's Protective Services residential facility in Sacramento, California, for 8 years, ever since her retirement from 35 years of teaching elementary school. But her real education had begun in her own childhood, when she had spent 4 years in foster care after her parents died in a house fire when she was 9. Margaret remembered exactly what it felt like to be a child with no family, to lie awake in unfamiliar beds, wondering if anyone in the world really cared, to watch other children get visited by grandparents while she sat alone during school, family events. She remembered the ache of not belonging anywhere, of having no one who remembered her favorite foods or knew how she liked her hair braided. The Sunrise facility housed children ages 4 through 17 who had been removed from unsafe homes and were waiting for permanent placement. Some would eventually be reunited with biological families. Others would be adopted, but many would age out of the system at 18 without ever finding a permanent family. Margaret's job title was Volunteer Family Enrichment Coordinator, but what she actually did was much simpler and much more complex. She became a grandmother to children who had never experienced unconditional love, who remembered their preferences and celebrated their achievements with the fierce protectiveness that only family members possess. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, Margaret arrived at Sunrise at 7 a.m., carrying a bag filled with home-baked cookies, craft supplies, homework help materials, and her precious notebook where she kept detailed records of each child's interests, fears, accomplishments, and dreams. She knew that 12-year-old Joshua loved dinosaurs and was terrified of loud noises. She remembered that 8-year-old Sophia's favorite color was purple and that she had never owned a birthday cake with her name written in frosting. Margaret's approach was different from the trained social workers and counselors. She didn't try to provide therapy or address trauma directly. Instead, she provided something many of these children had never experienced: the steady, reliable love of a family member who showed up consistently, who remembered what mattered to them, who celebrated their successes without judgment. She attended every school play, every soccer game, every parent-teacher conference for children who had no other family members. She helped with homework because she wanted each child to know that someone cared about their future. She taught older children how to braid younger ones' hair, how to tie shoes, how to ride bicycles, skills that many children learn from grandparents. Most importantly, Margaret made sure that every child at Sunrise knew that they belonged to someone. She created birthday celebrations for children who had never had birthday parties, complete with homemade cakes and carefully chosen presents. She organized holiday traditions that gave these children memories of family celebrations. She took pictures constantly, creating photo albums for each child so they would have visual proof that someone had cared enough to document their childhood. Margaret's own children and grandchildren had initially been puzzled by her decision to spend her retirement years working with other people's children, but they had gradually come to understand that Margaret's heart was simply too big to limit her love to blood relatives. The children at Sunrise didn't question why a woman with her own family chose to spend her time with them. They simply accepted Margaret's love as the miraculous gift it was, the first unconditional acceptance many of them had ever experienced. They trusted her in ways they had never trusted adults, confided in her their deepest fears and most secret hopes. Margaret's notebook was her most precious possession, filled with 8 years of careful documentation about children who had come and gone from Sunrise. She recorded their birthdays, their favorite foods, their achievements, their fears and dreams, their adoption placements. Some of her children were now in college. Others were starting careers. A few had gotten married. But Margaret stayed in touch with all of them, continuing to send birthday cards and graduation gifts. The Family Feud opportunity had come through her daughter-in-law, Sarah, who worked in television production, and had watched Margaret's tireless dedication to children who weren't related to her. Sarah had applied, believing that Margaret's story represented something important about what family really means and how love multiplies when it's shared freely. Margaret's family for the show consisted of Sarah, her son Michael, a high school principal, her biological granddaughter, Emma, a college student studying social work, and Jessica Martinez, a former Sunrise resident, who was now 25 and working as a pediatric nurse, who still called Margaret Grandma Maggie. The preparation for Family Feud had been both exciting and emotional for Margaret. When her family practiced survey questions about what makes children feel loved, Margaret's answers always came from her experience at Sunrise, being remembered, having someone show up for them, knowing they matter to someone. The morning of their taping, Margaret had completed her usual routine at Sunrise. She had helped 6 children get ready for school, attended a placement meeting for 9-year-old Isabella, who was being adopted, and promised 13-year-old Kevin that she would attend his school science fair the following week. Steve Harvey's pre-show meeting with the Thompson family was immediately different from typical contestant interactions. When he met Margaret, whose gentle demeanor and obvious comfort with children suggested someone who had spent her life nurturing others, Steve found himself talking with someone whose understanding of family extended far beyond traditional definitions. "Margaret," Steve said, "your family tells me you volunteer at a children's facility. Tell me about that work." Margaret's face lit up with warmth that had comforted hundreds of children. "I work at Sunrise, a residential facility for children who have been removed from unsafe homes. They're waiting for permanent placement, but while they're there, I try to be their grandmother." Steve was intrigued by the simplicity and profundity of her mission. "You try to be their grandmother. What does that mean exactly?" Margaret's response revealed her understanding of what children need most. "It means I show up consistently. I remember what matters to them. I celebrate their successes and comfort them when they're struggling. Most of these children have never had anyone who loved them just because they exist, not because of their behavior, but simply because they're worthy of love." Steve was struck by Margaret's dedication and by the way she spoke about children who weren't biologically related to her with the same fierce love that grandmothers typically reserved for their own grandchildren. "How many children are you grandmother to?" Margaret smiled, thinking about the notebook in her purse. "Right now, there are 47 children at Sunrise who call me Grandma Maggie, but over 8 years, I've been grandmother to 312 children. I keep track of all of them. I still send birthday cards to the ones who have been adopted or aged out of the system." The opposing family, the Rodriguez family from Florida, had initially approached the competition with enthusiasm, but when they learned about Margaret's work with children and protective services and witnessed her obvious devotion to creating family for children who had none, their competitive energy transformed into respect and admiration. When Steve Harvey took the stage, the studio buzzed with anticipation, but there was an undercurrent of reverence. Recognition that this episode would include someone whose life had been dedicated to proving that love doesn't require blood relations, that family can be created through choice and commitment. The family introductions revealed the Thompson family's values of service, inclusion, and the belief that every child deserves to belong somewhere. Steve learned about Michael's work in education, about Emma's plans to become a social worker, about Sarah's career in television, and about Jessica's journey from foster care to professional nursing. "Margaret," Steve said during the introductions, "you've been a volunteer grandmother to hundreds of children over 8 years. What's the most rewarding part of that work?" Margaret looked out at the studio audience and cameras, and her response carried the wisdom of someone who had learned that the most meaningful relationships are often the ones we choose to create. "The most rewarding part is watching children learn to trust love," she said. "When a child has been hurt by the adults who were supposed to protect them, they often decide that it's safer not to love anyone. My job is to show them that love doesn't always hurt, that some people can be trusted to stay." The game began with Margaret participating in the face-off. The question was, "Name something that makes children feel secure." Margaret buzzed in confidently and answered, "Knowing someone will always be there for them." It was the #1 answer on the board, and the Thompson family chose to play. As the round continued, each family member's answers reflected their understanding of what children need to thrive and feel loved. When it was time for the third round, Margaret was at the podium again. The category was "Name something grandmothers are known for," and Steve approached her with obvious respect for the woman who had extended grandmotherly love to hundreds of children. Margaret, you've been a grandmother to hundreds of children. Name something grandmothers are known for. Margaret thought about all the children at Sunrise who had never experienced grandmotherly love before meeting her. Remembering what matters to each child, she said. It was the number 2 answer on the board, and the studio audience applauded with unusual warmth. This wasn't just a game show response. This was wisdom from someone who understood that love is often demonstrated through the details we choose to remember. But it was during the 4th round that the moment everyone would remember forever finally arrived. The category was Name the Most Valuable Thing Grandmothers Give Their Grandchildren, and after family members had provided answers like wisdom, cookies, and unconditional love, it was Margaret's turn. Steve walked over to Margaret's position at the podium, microphone in hand, and addressed the woman who had spent 8 years proving that the most important gifts can't be wrapped or purchased. Margaret, the most valuable thing grandmothers give their grandchildren is. Margaret looked at Steve, then at her family, then at the studio audience, filled with people who probably took their own family relationships for granted. When she spoke, her voice carried the certainty of someone who had witnessed the transformation that happens when a child finally experiences unconditional belonging. The feeling of unconditionally belonging somewhere, she said simply. The words filled the studio with a truth that transcended typical game show entertainment. This wasn't just an answer about what grandmothers provide. This was insight into the fundamental human need to belong, to be chosen, to matter to someone regardless of circumstances or behavior. Steve Harvey, who had built his career on family entertainment, found himself facing someone who had dedicated her life to creating family for children who had been failed by the families they were born into. The feeling of unconditionally belonging somewhere, Steve repeated slowly, then louder. The feeling of unconditionally belonging somewhere. He set his microphone down and walked directly to where Margaret stood. The cameras kept rolling, but everyone in the studio understood that they were witnessing something that went beyond television. Margaret, Steve said, his voice thick with emotion, that might be the most important answer anyone has ever given on this show. He positioned himself directly in front of Margaret, speaking with the respect that one parent has for another who truly understands what children need most. You know what you just taught all of us? You taught us that family isn't about who gave birth to you or who shares your DNA. Family is about who shows up, who stays, who chooses to love you and make you feel like you belong somewhere in this world. Steve turned to address the entire studio, his voice carrying the weight of recognition for something profound. Ladies and gentlemen, this woman right here has been a grandmother to 312 children over 8 years, children who had been abandoned, abused, neglected. She didn't have to love these children, but she chose to become their family because she understood that every child needs to belong somewhere. The studio audience rose to their feet in sustained applause, but Steve wasn't finished. But that's not even the most incredible part. The most incredible part is that she keeps track of all of them. She has a notebook where she writes down their birthdays, their favorite things, their achievements. She created a family for children who had no family. Steve walked back to Margaret, who was standing quietly with tears in her eyes, overwhelmed by recognition for work she had always considered simply what needed to be done. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a well-worn notebook. As she opened it, Steve read over her shoulder. Joshua Williams, age 12, loves dinosaurs, afraid of thunderstorms, birthday March 15th, adopted by the Peterson family in 2019. Sophia Martinez, age 8, favorite color purple, loves to draw, birthday July 3rd, still at Sunrise. Steve's voice grew more emotional as he continued reading. This notebook has 312 names in it. 312 children who know that someone in this world remembers their birthday, knows what they love, cares about their dreams. That's not just being a volunteer, that's being family. The applause that followed wasn't just appreciation for Margaret's work, it was recognition from people who were realizing that love doesn't have biological limits, that family can be created through choice. But Steve had one more surprise. He had coordinated with the producers to bring out someone special, Jessica Martinez, the former Sunrise resident, who was now a pediatric nurse and still considered Margaret her grandmother. When Jessica walked onto the stage, Margaret's composure finally broke completely. The two women embraced with the fierce love of a grandmother, and granddaughter who had chosen each other. "This is Jessica," Steve announced. She lived at Sunrise 10 years ago when she was 15. Margaret became her grandmother, helped her graduate high school, supported her through nursing school. This is what it looks like when love creates family. The studio erupted in applause as Jessica took the microphone. "Grandma Maggie saved my life," she said simply. "She showed me that I was worth loving, that I belonged somewhere, that someone would always be in my corner. She's the family I never had, but always needed." The episode aired 8 weeks later and became a phenomenon that extended beyond typical game show entertainment. Margaret's story sparked national conversations about foster care, adoption, and the many ways that adults can create family for children who need belonging. The response was overwhelming. Sunrise Children's Protective Services received hundreds of volunteer applications. Other residential facilities across the country reported increases in volunteer grandparent programs. Most importantly, thousands of adults who had grown up in foster care reached out to share their own stories. Steve Harvey, who had entertained millions of families throughout his career, learned something profound about the difference between the families we're born into and the families we choose to create. In interviews afterward, he said, "Margaret taught me that love doesn't require DNA. It just requires someone willing to show up and stay." Margaret used her portion of the family's winnings to establish a fund for educational scholarships for children aging out of foster care and to purchase tablets for Sunrise residents. But the real prize was national recognition that her work mattered, that chosen family is real family, and that every child deserves to feel like they unconditionally belong somewhere. Margaret, Grandma Maggie Thompson, continues to volunteer at Sunrise 3 days a week, continues to maintain her notebook filled with the names and details of children who matter to her, and continues to prove that family is created through love, choice, and the daily decision to show up for people who need someone in their corner.